Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the dimly lit, wax-scented world of a 14th century French candle maker. Imagine it, the air heavy with the scent of burning tallow, the soft hiss of a freshly lit wick, and the warm, flickering light that dances across rough, hewn wooden walls. This is the life of a man whose days are spent toiling over bubbling vats of animal fat, pouring and shaping wax, and crafting the very object that keeps darkness at bay. But don't get too comfortable, you probably won't survive a single day in his shoes. It's messy, smelly, and more dangerous than you'd expect. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, drop a comment below with your location and the current time. I love knowing where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the heart of 14th century France, a small village where the sky is grey and the streets are slick with last night's rain. You pull your thin woolen cloak tighter around you as you make your way down a cobbled alleyway. The scent of burning tallow wafts through the air, acrid, gracy, a little bit sweet. It's coming from the candlemaker's workshop, a squat, stone building with a narrow door and a single window crusted with soot. Inside, you hear the low murmur of a man talking to himself. That's Jean, the candle maker. He's in his mid-40s, though the lines around his eyes make him look older. Candle making is a tough trade, and the years have worn him down. But he wasn't always a candle maker. Jean was born the youngest of 5 sons to a poor farmer. The farm was too small to feed all those mouths, so by the time Jean was 10, his father arranged for him to become an apprentice to the local candle maker, a man named Guillaume, who was as sore and bent as a twisted wick. Guillaume's workshop was a world away from the open fields Jean was used to. It was cramped and stifling, with the constant reek of melting tallow and the clanging of iron tools. Jane's first task: scraping the leftover wax drippings off the floorboards. Hours upon hours he spent, on his knees, prying away hardened wax with a dull knife. Guillaume was a hard man, but he knew his craft. Jean watched as Guillaume boiled down the tallow, carefully skimming off the impurities before pouring it into wooden molds. The first few times Jean tried to help, he spilled hot wax on his hands, blistering his skin. But over time, he learned. He learned how to measure the length of a wick, just right, too short, and the candle would burn too quickly, too long, and it would sputter out in minutes. He learned how to stir the tallow slowly to avoid bubbles, how to set the molds just right, and how to trim the wicks to an even length. But it wasn't just about making candles. Guillaume taught him how to spot the good tallow, the kind that came from well-fed cattle, creamy and white, not the rancid yellow stuff the butcher tried to pass off as fresh. Jean also learned that some customers preferred beeswax candles, far more expensive, but infinitely less smelly. Only the wealthy could afford those, and they burned cleaner and longer than anything made from tallow. As the years went by, Jane's hands became calloused and tough, his nails forever rimmed with wax. He learned to navigate the hierarchy of the candle, making world the apprentices at the bottom. Then the journeymen who could make candles unsupervised, and finally, the master candle makers, the elite few who ran their own shops and set their own prices. Guillaume was a master, but he was also a miser. He paid Jean in stale bread and thin soup, and when Jane finally asked for a few sus to send back to his family, Guillaume only laughed. "Candles don't make you rich, boy," he said, pouring a bucket of cold water over a fresh batch of candles to set them. "But they keep you out of the dark." One night, as Jean was tidying up the workshop, he found a half-burned candle stub with an odd, floral scent. It was unlike anything he'd ever smelled before, sweet, almost like roses. Guillaume caught him sniffing it and snatched it away. "That," he said, "is for the cathedral. Don't get any ideas." That was the first time Jean realized that candle making wasn't just about light. It was about scent, about ritual, about status. The nobles wanted candles that smelled like flowers and herbs, while the peasants would settle for anything that burned for more than a few hours. And so, Jane's mind began to wander. What if he could make candles that didn't just burn? What if they could transport you somewhere else, to a warm meadow, a summer garden, a distant memory? But for now, he was still an apprentice, and his life was a relentless cycle of scraping wax, boiling tallow, and avoiding Guillaume's sharp tongue. The years stretched on, and by the time Jean was 20, His hands were strong and steady. He knew the scent of good tallow, the feel of a perfectly twisted wick, the weight of a mold filled to the brim with hot wax. And he knew one thing more: he would not be an apprentice forever. The workshop is already awake before the sun rises. The air is thick with the scent of smouldering wicks and the sharp tang of animal fat. You can hear the hiss and bubble of tallow as it melts in a cast iron pot, the steam rising like a ghost against the dim, soot-streaked walls. Jean is at his workbench, sleeves rolled up, arms dusted with flecks of wax. Today, he's on a mission to craft the perfect candle. For most people in the village, candles are a luxury. They use them sparingly, lighting them only during evening prayers or special meals. But the wealthier merchants and minor nobility expect more, bigger, longer, burning candles, perfectly smooth and without a single air bubble. And those are the candles that bring in the real money. Jean dips a long, twisted wick into a vat of molten tallow. The tallow is still bubbling, and the heat singes the fine hairs on his forearm. He pulls the wick out, lets it drip, and waits for the first coat of wax to harden. Then, he dips it again, over and over, each layer thickening the candle. This process, the dipping, is both tedious and meditative. The rhythm of it is almost hypnotic: dip, drip, cool, dip, drip, cool. But there's more to it than repetition. The candle must be perfectly cylindrical, its surface smooth and even. If the tallow is too hot, the wax will run off in globs, creating unsightly lumps. If it's too cool, the layers will crack, leaving the candle fragile and prone to breaking. Jean watches the temperature closely, eyes fixed on the small flame beneath the pot. Too hot, and he risks burning the tallow, and that smell is nearly impossible to get out of the workshop. As he dips, he thinks back to the first candle he ever made by himself. It was lopsided, one end thicker than the other, and it burned unevenly, dripping wax like a leaky faucet. Guillaume had thrown it out without a word. If it doesn't burn straight, he'd said, it's no good to anyone. Now, Jean's candles burn straight. He knows how to twist the wick just right, how to keep it taut, but not too tight. And he's started experimenting, adding a few drops of lavender oil here, a pinch of dried rosemary there. Nothing extravagant, of course, just enough to mask the harsh scent of tallow. But he keeps these experiments to himself. Guillaume would never approve. The old man believes in tradition: plain tallow, plain wicks, plain candles. Anything else is a waste of time and resources. Still, Jane can't help himself. Late at night, after Guillaume has locked up and gone to bed, Jane sneaks back into the workshop. He lights a single candle, the flame casting long, dancing shadows against the stone walls. And then, he takes out his little box of secret ingredients: a tiny vial of rose oil, a handful of dried mint leaves, a scrap of beeswax he's managed to save. He melts the beeswax first. It's softer, smoother, and gives off a sweet, earthy scent as it melts. He adds a drop of rose oil, just one, and stirs the mixture until it's perfectly smooth. Then, he dips a wick into the blend, watching as the wax coats it like honey. This candle is smaller, thinner, more delicate than the heavy tallow tapers he makes during the day. But when he lights it, the scent of roses fills the room, gentle and calming, a whisper of something far away. Jean leans back, closes his eyes, and lets the scent wash over him. For a moment, he isn't a candle maker. He's a boy again, running through a summer meadow, the grass warm beneath his bare feet, the air thick with the scent of wild roses. But the moment passes. The candle burns down quickly. Beeswax doesn't last as long as tallow. And when the wick sputters out, he's just Jean, the apprentice candle maker, with wax-stained hands and a back that aches from too many hours spent hunched over the workbench. In the morning, Guillaume doesn't notice the missing bit of beeswax or the faint scent of roses lingering in the air. But Jean can still smell it, a trace of sweetness amidst the usual reek of tallow and smoke. The day drags on, and Jean keeps his head down, his hands moving through the motions without thinking. Dip, drip, cool. Dip, drip, cool. His mind is miles away, dreaming of a world where candles aren't just a source of light, they're a source of comfort, of memory, of escape. But dreams don't pay for firewood or bread. And so, when Guillaume shouts for him to hurry up, Jane snaps back to reality, his hands moving faster, his mind emptying like a bucket tipped over in the street. Hours later, as the sun begins to sink and the shadows grow long, Jean finally finishes the day's work. The candles, a dozen thick, sturdy tallow tapers, are neatly lined up on the workbench, their wicks trimmed and ready. Guillaume nods in approval, grunting a rare word of praise. Good work today, he says, tossing June a crust of bread. Jean takes the bread and chews it slowly, staring at the candles as they cool. They're solid, practical, serviceable. But they're not beautiful. Not like the rose-scented candle he made in secret the night before. But beauty is for nobles and cathedrals. For people with gold to spend and time to waste. For people who don't smell like tallow and ash and the faint, lingering scent of roses. It's another grey morning in the village. The cobbled streets are slick with rain, and the air is thick with the scent of wet earth and wood smoke. You trudge down the alleyway toward the workshop, feeling the dampness seep through the thin soles of your shoes. Inside, the air is warmer, heavy with the mingling smells of hot tallow, singed wicks, and Guillaume's stale breath. Today is market day, and that means a different kind of chaos. Candles need to be bundled, counted, and packed for transport. Guillaume paces the workshop, barking orders like a captain on a stormy sea.
Wrap those tapers tighter!
Double, not the twine. And for heaven's sake, don't drop anything. We can't afford to lose a single candle. Jane's hands move quickly, almost mechanically, as he ties bundles of tapers together with rough twine. Each bundle contains 5 candles, sturdy, thick, and a bit lumpy, the kind that burn long but not clean. These are the cheap ones, destined for the village square, where the peasants will haggle for a few measly sous. The better candles, the ones made from cleaner tallow, with wicks that don't sputter and die, are carefully wrapped in linen and set aside for the wealthier clientele. Guillaume saves those for the merchants and minor nobles, who can afford to pay a little extra for the privilege of not sitting in the dark. Once the candles are packed, Jane hoists the heavy basket onto his shoulder, feeling the weight press down through his spine. Guillaume follows close behind, grumbling about the rain and the mud and the cursed smell of tallow that never quite washes off. The village square is already buzzing with people, farmers selling turnips, a butcher shouting about fresh rabbit meat, a woman with a basket of half-dead chickens. The air is thick with voices, the scent of wet wool, and the faint, yeasty smell of yesterday's bread. Jean and Guillaume set up their stall beneath a sagging awning, and soon enough, the first customers arrive, a woman with a baby on her hip, her hair wrapped in a faded scarf. How much for 2 tapers? She asks, eyes darting from the candles to the tiny pouch of coins at her waist. Guillaume names his price, and the woman frowns, counting her coins with calloused fingers. Can't you go any lower? She asks. Last week, Pierre was selling them for half that. John keeps his eyes down, hands busy arranging the bundles of candles, but he knows how this will go. Guillaume's face is already turning red, his jaw tight. Pierre sells rubbish, he says, voice rising. Those candles don't last more than an hour. Ours will burn through the night. The woman looks unconvinced, but she hands over her coins and takes her 2 tapers. Jean watches her walk away, the baby on her hip, the candles wrapped in a bit of burlap. He wonders if she'll ration them, lighting them only for evening prayers or when the baby won't sleep. The morning drags on, and the crowd grows thicker. Jean's hands ache from lifting and stacking candles, his shoulders stiff from the constant weight of the basket. Guillaume handles the money, his scowl deepening every time someone tries to bargain him down. Then, just before noon, a shadow falls over the stall. Jean looks up to see a man in a long, dark coat, a merchant, by the look of him, with rings on his fingers and a heavy, fur-lined collar. I need candles for my daughter's wedding, the man says, voice thick with the nasal accent of the city. Not the usual tallow junk. Something special. Guillaume's expression shifts, a sly grin spreading beneath his bristly beard. We have just the thing, he says, reaching beneath the stall for the linen-wrapped bundle of the better candles. The merchant takes a candle and sniffs it, his face wrinkling. Smells like fat, he says, holding it at arm's length. That's because it's good tallow, Guillaume says, his tone suddenly saccharine. Burns longer, drips less. Perfect for a wedding feast. The merchant frowns, and Jean can see his chance slipping away. Before he can think, the words are tumbling out of his mouth. We have something better, he says, voice too loud, too quick. Guillaume shoots him a glare that could melt wax, but Jean ignores it. I've been working on a new blend. Jean continues, forcing himself to look the merchant in the eye. A little beeswax mixed with rose oil. It burns cleaner. Smells like a summer garden. The merchant raises an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. Where is it? Guillaume's jaw clenches, and for a second, Jean thinks he might actually get slapped in front of the entire market square. But then, Guillaume forces a tight smile. Yes, he says, the words like acid on his tongue. My apprentice here has been experimenting. Let me fetch it. Jane follows Guillaume back to the cart, where the old man grabs him by the collar and pulls him close. What in the devil's name do you think you're doing? He hisses, his breath hot and sour against Jane's ear. I can make it. Jane whispers, his heart pounding. Just give me an hour. Guillaume lets go, his eyes narrowed. You'd better hope it's the best candle he's ever seen. He mutters, or I'll skin you alive. John rushes back to the workshop, hands shaking as he gathers his ingredients, the beeswax he's been hiding, the rose oil, a scrap of rosemary for good measure. He melts the beeswax carefully, stirring slowly to avoid bubbles. He pours the hot wax into a small mold, the scent of roses filling the air, and dips the wick once, twice, 3 times. When the candle finally cools, it's smaller than the usual tallow tapers, slender, delicate, with a pale pink tint and a soft, floral scent. Jean wraps it in a strip of linen, ties it with twine, and races back to the market square. The merchant is still there, tapping his foot impatiently. This had better be worth the wait, he says, reaching for the candle. Jean holds his breath as the merchant sniffs it, his eyes closing for a moment. Interesting, the merchant says, a smile curving his lips. How much? Before Guillaume can speak, Jean blurts out the first number that comes to mind, a number higher than he's ever dared ask for a single candle. The merchant doesn't even flinch. He hands over the coins, tucks the candle into his coat, and disappears into the crowd. Guillaume says nothing. He just watches the merchant walk away, a strange expression on his face, a mix of anger, envy, and something else. Pride, maybe. Jean watches the merchant's shadow disappear down the alleyway, the scent of roses still lingering in the air. It's the first time he's sold one of his own candles. The first time he's dared to speak up. But it won't be the last. The sun is setting, and the village square is nearly empty. The other merchants have packed up their stalls, the farmers have driven their goats back to the fields, and the fishmonger's last few herring lie in a puddle of murky water. Jean and Guillaume are the last to leave, their cart heavy with unsold candles, and the lingering scent of tallow clinging to their clothes. As they trudge back toward the workshop, the silence is thick between them. Guillaume's jaw is clenched, his fists tight around the cart's handles. Jean keeps his eyes down, watching the cobblestones pass beneath his feet. The coins from the rose-scented candle jingle in his pocket, a heavy, unsettling sound. Inside the workshop, the air is stale and cold. Guillaume slams the door behind them, the echo reverberating through the small space. What were you thinking? He snaps, spinning around to face Jean. Jean opens his mouth to respond, but no words come out. His heart is still racing, his palms clammy. He wasn't thinking. He was just doing, acting on instinct, on some strange, reckless urge he barely understands. Guillaume's face is red, his nostrils flaring. We can't afford mistakes like that, he continues, voice rising. What if he hadn't liked it? What if he'd walked away? But he didn't. Jane says, his voice barely above a whisper. He bought it. He paid more than we usually get for a whole bundle. Guillaume stares at him, eyes narrowed. For a moment, the only sound is the crackling of the dying fire in the hearth. Then, Guillaume takes a deep breath and lets it out slowly, his shoulders slumping. Fine, he mutters, rubbing a hand over his stubbly chin. But don't do it again. We're candle makers, not perfumers. Jane nods, but the words feel hollow. The scent of roses still lingers in the workshop, soft and sweet, a ghost of something beautiful. Later that night, as Guillaume snores in his bed behind the curtain, John lies awake on his straw mat, staring up at the dark ceiling. The silver coins from the sale rest under his pillow, cool against his cheek. He closes his eyes and tries to sleep, but his mind won't settle. He keeps replaying the moment the merchant sniffed the candle, the way his eyes had closed. His shoulders had relaxed, the faint smile that had curved his lips. In that moment, John had felt powerful, important, like he'd created something special, something that mattered. The next morning, he rises before dawn, slipping quietly out of the workshop and into the misty alleyway. The air is damp and smells of wet stone. He walks quickly, head down, until he reaches the old chapel at the edge of the village. The door creaks as he pushes it open, the sound echoing through the empty nave. Inside, the chapel is dark and cold. Only a few candles burn on the altar, their tiny flames flickering like trapped fireflies. Jean steps forward, his footsteps loud against the stone floor. At the altar, the old priest is kneeling, his back bent and his hands folded in prayer. When he hears Jean approach, he lifts his head, his eyes sharp and knowing. "Couldn't sleep?" the priest asks, his voice low and rough. Jean shakes his head, swallowing hard. "I sold a candle yesterday," he says. "A special one, rose, scented." I didn't ask Guillaume first." The priest raises an eyebrow. "And how did Guillaume take it?" Jean hesitates. "Not well." The priest chuckles, a sound like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "Guillaume doesn't like change," he says. "Never has." "But that doesn't mean you were wrong." Jane frowns, his hands twisting in his lap. "But he said we can't afford to take risks." "And he's right," the priest says, leaning forward. "You can't afford to take risks if you're thinking like a poor man. But if you're thinking like a merchant, like someone who wants more than just enough to get by." He pauses, his eyes glinting in the candlelight. "Well, that's a different story." Jan swallows, his throat tight. "But what if I fail? What if no one wants to buy them?" The priest smiles, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small, round object. It's a candle, tiny, barely the size of a plum. The wax is smooth and pale, and when the priest lights the wick, the scent of lavender fills the air. "I made this," the priest says, holding the candle out to Jean. "Years ago, when I was still a novice. My master said the same thing, don't waste time with silly scents. Stick to plain tallow." But I didn't listen. Jane takes the candle, cradling it in his palms. The lavender scent is soft and calming, wrapping around him like a warm blanket. "What happened?" he asks, voice hushed. The priest leans back, his eyes drifting to the altar. "I sold them to a merchant from Paris. He took them back to the city, and before I knew it, I was making more money from those little scented candles than I'd ever made from the plain ones." Jane stares at the candle, the flame casting tiny, dancing shadows across his face. "But Guillaume is a good man," the priest says, his voice gentle. "But he's afraid of what he doesn't understand." "You're not him, Jean. You see things differently." John takes a deep breath, the scent of lavender filling his lungs. "What if I tried again?" The priest smiles, his eyes twinkling. "Then you'd be taking a risk. And sometimes, that's the only way to get anywhere." Jan nods, slipping the lavender candle into his pocket. As he walks back to the workshop, the sun is rising, turning the grey stones of the village to gold. The streets are quiet, the air still cool and crisp. Inside, Guillaume is still asleep, his snores rattling the thin wooden walls. Jean slips quietly to the workbench, his hands moving without thinking, reaching for the beeswax, the rose oil, the tiny scrap of rosemary. This time, he isn't afraid. This time, he knows exactly what he's doing. The workshop is quiet except for the soft, rhythmic scraping of Jean's knife against the candle mold. Outside, the morning mist clings to the cobblestones, muffling the sounds of villagers starting their day. Inside, the air is warmer, filled with the scent of melting beeswax and crushed rosemary. Jean's hands move quickly, slicing through the cooled wax, trimming the edges, smoothing the surface. The candle is slender, delicate, nothing like the thick, lumpy tallow tapers that line the shelves behind him. This one is pale green, speckled with flecks of rosemary and a hint of rose oil. It smells like a garden after the rain, soft and fresh. As Jean works, he keeps one eye on the curtain that separates the workshop from Guillaume's sleeping quarters. The old man is still snoring, a low, rumbling sound like distant thunder. Jane's heart races each time the snores pause, each time Guillaume shifts or mutters in his sleep. Finally, the candle is done. Jean holds it up to the light, turning it slowly, watching the way the green wax glows in the morning sun. It's beautiful, more beautiful than anything he's ever made. But will it sell? Jean takes a deep breath, tucks the candle into a strip of linen, and slips it into his pocket. Then he quietly gathers his tools, wiping the wax shavings from the workbench, brushing the crumbs into a small wooden bowl. Just as he's finishing, the curtain rustles, and Guillaume steps into the workshop, yawning and rubbing his eyes. His hair is a wild mess, his shirt half untucked, and his scowl as fierce as ever. "Hop early," he grunts, squinting at Jean. "Couldn't sleep." Jane forces a smile, his heart pounding. "Thought I'd get a head start on the day." Guillaume grunts again, shuffling over to the workbench. He picks up a half-formed tallow candle, turning it over in his hands. "We're behind on orders," he mutters, more to himself than to Jane. Need at least 50 more tapers by noon. Think you can handle that? John nods, keeping his face neutral, his hands steady. Of course. Guillaume doesn't seem to notice the strain in Jane's voice. He just drops the candle back onto the bench, scratching at the stubble on his jaw. Good, he says, already heading for the door. I'll be back in an hour. Don't slack off. The door slams shut behind him, and the workshop falls silent. Jean waits, breath held, until Guillaume's heavy footsteps fade down the alleyway. Then he moves quickly, grabbing his coat, his basket, the rose, scented candle wrapped in linen. The market square is already bustling by the time Jane arrives. Farmers shout about fresh apples, a street musician plucks at a broken lute, and a pair of children chase each other through the crowd, laughing and shrieking. Jean weaves through the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces, looking for a familiar one. He's almost to the far end of the square when he spots her, a woman in a grey cloak, her dark hair pulled back in a braid, her eyes sharp and curious. It's Isabeau, the herb seller. She's standing by her cart arranging small bundles of dried lavender, rosemary, and thyme. As Jan approaches, she looks up, her eyebrows lifting. Jane, she says, her voice warm but wary. What brings you here so early? Jan swallows, forcing himself to smile. I need your opinion, he says, pulling the candle from his pocket and holding it out to her. Isabeau takes it, turning it over in her hands, sniffing the wax, rubbing her thumb over the smooth surface. Rosemary, she murmurs. And rose oil. John nods, his pulse quickening. Do you think it'll sell? Isabeau looks at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. Depends, she says. Who are you selling to? The peasants won't pay more than a sus for a candle, no matter how nice it smells. Jane's shoulders slump, the excitement draining from him. But what about the merchants? Isabeau purses her lips, considering. Maybe, she says. If you can find the right buyer, someone with money. Someone who cares about little luxuries. Jane nods, his mind racing. The merchant from yesterday, the one with the fur-lined coat, the rings on his fingers. He's the kind of man who might pay extra for a candle that smells like roses. But how to find him? Isabeau is watching June closely, her eyes softening. You know, she says, leaning in, lowering her voice. There's someone you could talk to. Jane blinks, leaning forward. Who? Isabeau glances around, as if checking for eavesdroppers. Madame Cecile, she whispers. She runs the bathhouse by the river. Her clients are merchants, nobles, the kind of people who can afford scented candles. Jane's heart leaps, his pulse quickening. Think she'd talk to me? Isabeau shrugs, a sly smile curving her lips. For the right price. Jane's face falls. He barely has enough coins to buy bread for the week, let alone bribe a bathhouse mistress. But Isabeau just chuckles, patting his shoulder. Relax, she says. I'll introduce you. Just don't embarrass me. John nods, his heart pounding. Thank you, he whispers, clutching the candle tight. They walk together toward the river, the narrow alleys growing darker, the scent of the river thick and brackish in the air. The bathhouse is a low, wooden building with steam rising from its roof, and a painted sign of a naked woman holding a towel. Inside, the air is warm and damp, scented with lavender and thyme. Women in loose robes lounge on padded benches, chatting softly, their faces flushed from the steam. A man with a gold tooth laughs as a girl pours warm water over his shoulders. Madame Cecile stands in the center of the room, a plump, dark-haired woman with a silk robe and a knowing smile. When she sees Isabeau, her eyes light up. Darling, she coos, pulling Isabeau into a hug. What brings you here? Isabeau gestures to Jan, who steps forward, clutching the candle so hard his knuckles turn white. This is Jean, Isabeau says. He's got something different. Madame Cecile raises an eyebrow, eyeing Jean from head to toe. Different, huh? Jane swallows, his throat dry. It's a candle, he says, unwrapping the linen and holding it out, scented with rosemary and rose oil. Madame Cecile takes it, sniffing delicately, her eyes closing for a brief, telling moment. When she opens them again, she's smiling. How much? Jan's heart pounds, the words tumbling out before he can stop them. 3 sus. Madame Cecile laughs, a deep, throaty sound that echoes through the room. 3 sos for a candle. You must be joking. Jan's stomach sinks, his cheeks burning. But then to his surprise, Madame Cecile's smile widens. I'll take 10, she says. If you can make them by the end of the week. Jan nods, his head spinning. 10 candles. 3 sus each. enough to cover his rent and more. As he and Isabeau walk back to the village, the sun is setting, and the air is thick with the scent of rosemary and rose oil. For the first time, Jane feels like he's finally onto something. Jean's days now follow a gentle, repetitive rhythm, each one steeped in the quiet glow of candlelight and the sweet scent of rosemary. The workshop hums softly with the steady drip of molten wax, the scrape of blades, and the faint crackle of burning tallow in the hearth. Outside, the village moves in slow circles. Farmers tending their fields, children chasing one another through alleys, and merchants calling out their wares in sing-song voices. Jean begins experimenting with the candle recipe, trying to capture new scents and textures. He mixes beeswax with a touch of lavender or crushed mint, inspired by Isabeau's fragrant herbs. Sometimes he adds crushed petals of marigold, which turns the wax a gentle golden hue. The colours and smells become his small joys in the otherwise monotonous days. One afternoon, as Jen stirs a pot of melted wax, his thoughts drift to a curious bit of gossip he heard from the travelling monk who passed through town last week. The monk claimed that in distant England, some candle makers were blending wax with whale oil to create lamps that burned brighter and longer. Historians still argue whether this was widespread or just a merchant's tall tale meant to sell exotic products. Jean wonders if he might one day try a similar experiment. But for now, his modest stockpile of beeswax and fragrant herbs seems more than enough to keep Madame C.A. happy. And that is what matters most. Though Jean has settled into this gentle routine, he's not without his distractions. Occasionally, the village gossip reaches his ears, whispers of peculiar laws restricting who may sell certain goods, tales of odd customs in far-off lands where people bathe only once a year or wear masks made from animal hides. The world beyond the village is vast and strange, a tapestry of oddities that only fuels Jean's quiet fascination. In quieter moments, Jean reflects on the weight of expectations pressing down on him. His father's voice still echoes in his mind, warning of the dangers of failure. Yet, beneath the pressure lies a slow, burning hope that his humble candles might light a different path. A small rebellion of beauty and scent in a world often dim and harsh. At night, when the village sleeps and the moon casts silver shadows on the rooftops, Jean sometimes recalls an odd medieval belief he read about. Some candle makers used to add crushed crystals or powdered bone to their wax, believing it would protect homes from evil spirits. Historians still debate whether this was common practice or simply superstition among certain guilds. Jean chuckles softly at the thought, imagining a candle warding off ghosts while he dreams. With each flicker of flame and gentle scent wafting through the air, Jane's world grows a little larger, a little brighter, and the promise of tomorrow's light softly unfolds before him. The days blend into weeks, and Jane's hands grow more confident with each candle he crafts. His workshop, once cluttered and dim, now smells perpetually of herbs and warm wax, a small haven of calm amid the village's chatter and clatter. Yet, beneath this soothing routine, new challenges begin to take shape, ones that Jane hadn't quite anticipated. One morning, as Jane is preparing his ingredients, he overhears a conversation between two merchants passing by the shop. They speak of shifting markets in Paris, where newer candle makers experiment with strange additives like tallow mixed with resin from pine trees. Apparently, these candles burn longer, but leave a sticky residue, which annoys some buyers. Historians still argue whether such mixtures were practical or mostly gimmicks to catch buyers' attention. Jean frowns, wondering if he should try such mixtures to keep pace or stick to his simpler, fragrant beeswax candles. After all, Madame C.A. seems pleased with his current offerings, but the thought of competition gnaws at his confidence. That evening, John decides to visit the village apothecary, a tiny shop filled with dusty jars and the faint smell of dried herbs. The apothecary, a wizened woman named Marguerite, is known for her knowledge of plants and potions, but also for her fondness for old wives' tales. Jean hopes to find new ideas for scents or additives to enhance his candles. Marguerite greets him with a crooked smile, looking to make your candles more interesting. Are you? She says, pulling out a small jar of crushed cinnamon bark. Try this. It's said to keep the air fresh and chase away drowsiness. Jane chuckles. That's the last thing my customers want, he replies softly, but perhaps a little spice might add warmth. And Marguerite nods knowingly. There are also old recipes that call for powdered ambergris, though that's rare and expensive, or crushed frankincense. Adds a hint of the exotic. As Jean listens, He recalls an odd story from the local clergy. They say monks once used candle smoke to mask the scent of burning incense during prayer, believing it brought them closer to heaven. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic or a practical necessity. Jean thanks Marguerite and leaves with a small bundle of spices and resins, eager to experiment. Back at the workshop, he carefully blends cinnamon and rosemary into his beeswax, watching the warm mixture swirl. The scent is comforting, like a hearth fire in winter. As he molds the candles, Jean feels a new sense of purpose, that his work, though humble, carries with it the whispers of ancient traditions and modern hopes alike. Despite the challenges, Jean's resolve deepens. With each new scent and shape, he crafts more than candles. He's weaving stories of comfort and light for those who might one day drift off to sleep in their gentle glow. The village begins to prepare for the approaching winter, a time when candlelight will rule the long, cold evenings. Jane notices the growing demand for candles, not just from villagers, but from travelers and merchants passing through. This seasonal rush brings a new urgency to his work, a steady pressure that pushes him to refine both his craft and his business. Jean spends early mornings dipping wicks and evenings trimming edges, the soft crackling of the hearth his constant companion. He muses about how candles, though simple, are the silent heroes of medieval life, illuminating kitchens where meals are prepared, chapels where prayers are whispered, and even the occasional late-night scribbler copying manuscripts by flickering flame. One evening, while polishing a newly made batch, Jean recalls a curious fact from his reading. Some medieval candle makers coated their candles with thin layers of powdered lead to make them burn longer and straighter. Historians still argue whether this practice was widespread or confined to only the wealthiest households, and whether the health consequences were understood at the time. Jane shudders at the thought but reminds himself that his candles will remain natural, free from dangerous additives. Outside the workshop, the village square fills with the sound of merchants hawking winter goods, furs, dried meats, and woven cloths. Jane hears whispers about distant lands where people use rushlights, bundles of dried reeds soaked in grease, as a cheaper light source. The idea seems odd to him, as rushlights flicker dimly and smell unpleasant, but he understands the need for alternatives in lean times. Jean's relationship with Madame Cécile deepens during these busy weeks. She shares stories of her youth, when the town was smaller and winters colder, and candles were considered a luxury only for special occasions. She speaks of festivals where entire streets were lit by hundreds of hand-crafted candles, creating a glow like a sea of stars. As Jean listens, he feels a gentle warmth spread through him. His candles might not light grand festivals, but they will bring comfort to individual homes, enough to chase away the long shadows of winter nights. Jean's experiments continue. One night, inspired by Marguerite's apothecary, he tries blending beeswax with a hint of crushed lavender and rosemary, hoping to create a candle that soothes weary minds and invites restful sleep. The scent is subtle but comforting, and Jean smiles as he imagines villagers settling down after a long day, the gentle glow and soft fragrance easing them into peaceful dreams. He chuckles to himself, recalling a medieval belief that lavender was the favorite flower of angels, a notion that brings a whimsical edge to his work. Historians still debate whether such associations were widespread or localized folk tales passed down through generations. As winter's first snowflakes begin to drift softly outside, Jean feels the quiet pride of a craftsman whose work is both humble and essential, lighting the way through the darkest hours with patience and care. Winter deepens, and the village settles into a slower pace beneath a soft blanket of snow. The chill seeps into every corner, and the need for warmth and light becomes more urgent. Jane's candles are in steady demand now, carried to hearths and chapels alike, their gentle flames casting dancing shadows on frost-lined windows. Jane rises early one frosty morning to prepare a fresh batch of candles, his breath misting in the cold air as he works. The familiar scent of melted wax and herbs blends with the sharp tang of winter pine that drifts in from the forest beyond the village. It's a comforting combination, one that seems to hold the very essence of the season. In moments of quiet, Jane reflects on the curious evolution of candles in his time. He remembers a story told by a traveling merchant about candle clocks, used in some monasteries, candles marked with notches that slowly burn down to measure time. Historians still argue whether these were practical devices or symbolic rituals for marking prayer hours. Jean wonders if such devices might help him manage his own long days. though part of him suspects that keeping time by the flicker of flame could only invite distraction. As he dips another wick, Jean contemplates the delicate balance between craftsmanship and necessity. Each candle must burn steadily, casting enough light to pierce the darkness, but never so fiercely as to startle or annoy. He recalls reading about ancient Egyptians who once used rushes dipped in tallow for illumination, their smoky light a far cry from the gentle glow of his own beeswax creations. The village, meanwhile, continues its seasonal rituals. Each evening, families gather around fires to share stories and meals, the soft flicker of candlelight adding a layer of warmth to their voices. Jean sometimes hears faint laughter or the distant hum of songs drifting on the cold air, reminders that even in the bleakest months, life carries on with quiet joy. One night, while trimming the wick of a candle, he's made with a touch of crushed mint and honey, Jean recalls a peculiar medieval belief. Some thought that burning candles made from pure beeswax could ward off evil spirits, while tallow candles were less effective. Historians still debate the origins and significance of such superstitions, but Jane can't help but smile at the idea of his humble work as a shield against the unseen. The days grow shorter, and Jane's thoughts drift to the coming spring. For now, he takes solace in the steady, warm glow of his candles, each one a tiny beacon against the cold and darkness. With winter at its peak, the village embraces the long nights with quiet traditions and whispered hopes for the returning sun. Jane's workshop glows with steady light, candles stacked carefully in neat rows, ready for delivery to the villagers who count on them to brighten their hearths and hearts. One chilly afternoon, Jean recalls a fascinating tidbit from his reading in some parts of Europe. Candle makers were also responsible for crafting the wax seals that secured letters and documents, their designs ranging from simple family crests to intricate patterns symbolizing power and prestige. Historians still argue whether the skills overlapped widely or remained distinct trades. Jean chuckles, imagining himself stamping tiny seals on his candles as if each one carried a secret message. Maybe one day, he thinks, he could carve a personal emblem into the wax, an intimate signature for his customers. While pondering this, Jane's mind wanders to the peculiar lighting customs of distant lands he's heard about from traveling merchants. For example, in parts of Asia, lamps fueled by oil extracted from sesame or camellia seeds were common, emitting a softer, steadier glow than candles. It's a reminder of how light takes many forms, each shaped by culture and environment. Back in the village, Jane observes how candles serve not just practical needs but also social rituals. They are present during weddings, where their flames symbolize hope and new beginnings, and during quiet vigils held in memory of lost loved ones. This dual role as both tool and symbol deepens John's appreciation for his craft. As he melts wax late one evening, John experiments with a blend infused with crushed violet petals, aiming for a subtle floral scent that might calm restless minds. The aroma is delicate, like a whisper from a forgotten garden. He recalls an old belief that violets were associated with modesty and love, a notion that historians still debate in terms of its prevalence and origin. The scent stirs a gentle smile. Jean imagines his candles burning softly in homes where stories of love and loss unfold beneath their flickering light. Despite the cold outside, Jean feels a quiet warmth within, a sense that his simple work carries meaning beyond the flickering flames, connecting lives and histories in gentle, luminous threads. As the winter slowly recedes and the first hints of spring begin to warm the air, Jane notices subtle changes in the village's rhythm. Days lengthen, shadows shrink, and there's an undercurrent of renewal woven into the usual hum of daily life. His workshop reflects this shift, too. Candles infused with fresh herbs like thyme and rosemary replace the heavier scents of winter. Jean reflects on the surprising role candles have played throughout history, especially during festivals celebrating light's return after the darkest months. He recalls hearing about the medieval feast of Candlemas, where churches were filled with hundreds of blessed candles symbolizing hope and purification. Historians still argue whether the ceremony originated primarily from pagan traditions or early Christian adaptations. Jean's curiosity is piqued. He wonders what it would be like to witness such a grand display, the air thick with wax and prayers, the soft glow illuminating the faces of villagers in reverent silence. One afternoon, while packaging a batch of small beeswax tapers, John's thoughts wander to the intricate process of candle making itself. He remembers an obscure fact. Some craftsmen specialized in making carved candles, elaborately layered and twisted to form decorative shapes, often used as gifts or offerings. This level of artistry was rare and highly prized. Though Jean's own creations are simpler, he feels a quiet pride, knowing that each candle he crafts carries the warmth of tradition and care. In the evenings, Jean enjoys walking through the village, watching as candlelight spills from windows like tiny stars scattered across the snow-melted streets. He smiles at the sight of families gathering, the glow of flickering flames blending with the fresh scent of budding flowers. There's also a whisper of change beyond the village. Merchants speak of new trade routes opening, bringing exotic goods like sugar and spices from distant lands. Jean imagines these scents mingling with his candles, sparking new combinations and stories. As the season turns, Jane feels a sense of hope blooming alongside the crocuses and daffodils, his humble craft a quiet part of the endless cycle of light and life. Spring settles firmly into the village, coaxing green shoots from the earth and brightening every corner with fresh light. Jean's workshop fills with new energy, not only from the lengthening days, but from his own evolving ideas about candle making. He experiments with subtle blends, adding hints of chamomile or lemon balm, inspired by stories from Margaret's apothecary about their calming properties. One evening, as Jean dips another batch of wicks, he muses on the role of candlelight in medieval storytelling. Tales were told by fire and flame, shadows cast against rough stone walls bringing legends and fables to life. It's a comforting thought that his work, however humble, fuels imagination and community alike. Jean also recalls a curious fact: in some monasteries, monks used candle clocks, candles marked with lines that burned down to indicate time past, helping them keep vigil and prayer schedules. Historians still debate whether these were practical tools or more symbolic markers of devotion. The thought makes Jean smile, imagining a candle as a gentle timekeeper rather than a harsh clock, its flickering flame a reminder to slow down and savor the moment. Outside, village life hums along. Farmers prepare fields, children play in warming sunlight, and merchants return with new stories of distant lands. Jean overhears talk of sugar arriving from the east, a rare luxury that some hopefuls experiment with in their cooking. The village's changing seasons and shifting fortunes mirror Jean's own journey, a blend of tradition and innovation, patience and curiosity. Sometimes, when the evening quiet settles deep, Jean reflects on the strange fact that candles were once precious enough to be used as currency or gifts to royalty. The idea that his simple creations hold value beyond mere light fills him with quiet satisfaction. As spring breathes new life into the village, Jean feels the steady flame of purpose glowing brighter within him, ready to face whatever seasons lie ahead. The buzz of spring brings fresh visitors to the village, travelers, merchants, and curious folk passing through on their way to bigger towns or far-off cities. Jean often finds himself swapping stories with these newcomers, picking up snippets of distant customs and unusual uses for candles he hadn't imagined. One merchant tells of the Far East, where lantern festivals light up entire cities, paper and silk glowing in myriad colors. Jean smiles, picturing these delicate lights swaying gently in a warm spring breeze, so different from the steady beeswax glow he knows. Historians still debate how much influence Eastern lighting traditions had on European candle making, but Jean appreciates the shared human love for light after darkness. Jane also learns about the role of candles in healing rituals, where light was believed to ward off illness or melancholy. He remembers Marguerite's tinctures, herbal remedies mixed carefully to soothe the body and spirit, and wonders if the warmth of his candles might carry some of that healing power too. One curious fact sticks with him. Some medieval Europeans thought that the way a candle burned, whether steady or flickering, could predict the future or reveal hidden truths. This belief, though dismissed by many, adds a hint of mystery to Jane's otherwise practical craft. As days grow warmer, Jane's routine shifts. He spends more time outside, collecting herbs and observing the forest's awakening. The scent of fresh pine and wildflowers seeps into his clothes, mingling with the familiar waxy aroma of his workshop. At night, Jane watches the village settle under starlight, the soft flicker of candles from windows casting pools of light on cobblestones. The scene is peaceful, a gentle reminder that light in the dark is not just practical, but profoundly comforting. He feels a quiet gratitude for his simple role in this cycle, crafting little flames that bring warmth, guidance, and sometimes a touch of wonder to those around him. With summer on the horizon, the village's pace quickens. Fields swell with crops, and the air carries the mingled scents of ripe fruit, fresh earth, and the occasional waft of smoke from a distant hearth. Jean's candles remain a steady presence, a soft glow in the long, warm evenings. Jean notices that as days stretch longer, some villagers prefer lighter illumination, small, quick burning tapers rather than large, steady candles. He experiments with thinner wicks and different wax blends, hoping to capture this delicate balance. It's a subtle art, and historians still debate how candle makers refine their techniques across regions and eras to meet such varied needs. Jean's thoughts turn to the seasonal festivals, where candles play roles beyond mere light. He remembers stories of midsummer celebrations, when flames were believed to protect crops and bless the earth. Some villagers prepare intricate candle displays, their flickering lights woven into garlands and wreaths. One night, Jean works late, his hands steady despite the fading light outside. He recalls a quirky medieval tradition in some towns. A candle was passed around during gatherings to symbolize unity and shared stories. The flame, ever fragile, reminded all of their fleeting time together. Jean smiles at this image, his own candles, humble and practical, connected to these deeper currents of community and memory. He's also heard that in some cultures, the leftover candle wax was carefully collected and saved, believed to hold the essence of the light it once carried. The idea seems almost poetic, a reminder that even the smallest remnants can carry meaning. As summer nights deepen, Jean feels the comforting pulse of his craft, a quiet light in an ever-turning world. Summer fades gently into early autumn, painting the village in soft hues of amber and rust. The air cools just enough to remind Jean that soon he will return to crafting candles that burn long into the chilly nights. For now, he savors these lingering days, each one filled with the familiar rhythm of wax, wick, and flame. Jean's mind drifts to the curious history of candle makers' guilds, exclusive groups that safeguarded secrets of their trade, upheld quality, and protected members from competition. He finds it fascinating how such guilds shape medieval economies and social order. Historians still argue whether these guilds fostered innovation or stifled it, but Jean sees them as communities bound by shared craft and pride. That evening, Jean experiments with a new wax blend, mixing beeswax with a hint of bay leaves for a subtle, earthy scent. The scent reminds him of forest walks and quiet contemplation. He imagines his candles lighting homes where stories are told, where families gather, and where silence itself is a comfort. He also reflects on the whimsical folklore of the candle maker's trade. For instance, some believe that candle wax dripped onto the ground could protect homes from evil spirits, or that lighting a candle in a certain way could bring good luck. Whether true or fanciful, these tales add a layer of magic to his everyday work. As Jean packs his latest batch, he feels a steady calm, his hands skilled, his purpose clear. The simple flicker of a candle flame, he knows, holds centuries of human hope, warmth, and quiet resilience. Outside, the village prepares for the coming winter, and Jean readies himself to once again become the quiet keeper of light in the dark. Now, as the days grow shorter and the night embraces the village, you settle deeper into your space, feeling the steady pulse of candlelight's history weaving through time. Imagine the soft glow spilling gently over your surroundings, a slow dance of shadows and warmth that carries you away from the busy noise of waking life. The story of Jean, the candle maker, fades softly like the last ember of a hearth's fire, peaceful, familiar, and reassuring. No hurry, no rush, just the gentle unfolding of moments, like the flame's steady breath in the quiet dark. Take a deep breath, feel the calm seep in, and let your thoughts drift with the flickering light. Tonight, you rest in a long tradition of warmth and wonder, cradled by centuries of quiet craft and gentle care. Sleep well, friend. The candle burns low, and your journey into dreams begins.